every country on the globe, okay, kind of agrees with. You see? And all the different, and why that's problematic. Okay? Now, in terms of, people have agreed, people have signed contracts. Remember I told you guys that when the Helsinki Accords, 1976, I think it was, someone should, if you wanted to double check, do a quick query on Helsinki Accords. It happened during President Carter's administration. First time ever in the history of international relations, human rights were elevated to the table, negotiation table. And the human rights accords, I believe, signed by 150 some odd countries, including the Soviet Union. Okay, including the Soviet Union, where they agreed to kind of adhere to certain rules and regulations regarding three baskets: security, economics, and we know those are relevant issues, themes in IR, right? But they elevated human rights to that level, alongside security, economics, and human rights. And out of that emerged the Helsinki Commission in the United States, where it was a bipartisan commission. When I did my summer internship as a summer staff assistant at the Helsinki Commission in 1980, goodness gracious, would have been 87, perhaps 88. It was chaired by Dante Fissel, who's since passed away. But the job was to monitor whether or not countries are following. And from the U.S. point of view, they were very aggressively pursuing violations of part of human rights and part of the Soviet Union. So a country can even sign a treaty and do what? Begin to kind of violate. Okay? So, all right. Now, when we talk about liberalism in human rights, when we talk about realism in human rights, now the book talks about feminist theory in human rights. I have to be honest with you ladies. I'm being very honest. I'm always a little bit uncomfortable talking about feminist theory in human rights because, why do you think I'd be uncomfortable?
Because we're quiet.
No. Because what am I? A guy. And if you really want to see a funny thing about the whole notion of guys talking about women's rights, watch The Daily Show.
I can talk about it.
Jon Stewart. Stewart has a great piece, came out last week, all about guys, two people talking about women's rights in a room full of women. It's hilarious. My point is, it is illogical if you apply feminist theory, for me to be able to do what? Talk about feminist theory, right? Only because I wouldn't, in a radical interpretation, I would not be able to understand it because I'm looking at it from the vantage point of a male rather than a woman. So I really don't go into it as much, but we'll talk about liberalism and realism, okay? Now,
Professor,
yeah.
The human rights, it's a charter, right? Signed.
There's a UN charter, correct?
Does it change or is it the same? Like, can
I
we
mean,
add things to it?
I mean, any charter itself can always be amended,
Yeah.
okay? And every institution has a process that it follows. You know, any constitution, any charter, any law, anything can always be amended as long as you fulfill the procedures that govern the amendment process.
But I mean, like,
Nothing is ever, literal. Although, I mean, in a secular sense, I mean, you may have issues that are metaphysical, religious, that people take texts literally. But when you're talking about secular decision making, which is, when individuals are agreeing to something on a secular level, sure, it's always amendable. Okay? If someone says something isn't, then they're elevating it above the secular level by making it a religious kind of doctrine. Yeah.
can a country not agree with something?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, you cannot agree. But if you not agree with something, then you are then in trouble, particularly because if you don't agree with something that the institution agrees with, then you have a problem. The flip side is that always waters on any kind of agreement because every country's got to agree for it to work. Okay, so the more people you have participating in the collaboration process, the more ambiguous something is going to be because you got to accommodate everybody's concerns and interests. Okay? All right. So now this chapter, even though it talks about human rights, okay, spends a lot of time on focusing on human condition. In other words, there is this kind of assumption here that there is a certain kind of right to kind of live in a, or there's, that a person's condition, okay, state of being, all right, there's a certain kind of right out there. That's where this chapter is kind of going with this. And what it talks about is that if you take a look at the world, all right, and you take a look at your life here in Kuwait, okay, most of you, if not everyone in here, okay, going to AUK, is in a certain kind of, lives in a certain kind of standard that other people in Kuwait don't live, right? And take that to the extreme where you're looking at the whole world. And as it points out, if you take a look at the global south, 53% of the people live on $2 or less per day. Okay? Think about this. Now, you ever ask yourself why, whenever there's this massive earthquake or some sort of tsunami or some sort of natural disaster that wipes out some of these different areas around the planet, why within a couple of days, 3 days, 4 days, there are all these types of concerns regarding the welfare of the people, like with disease, lack of food, and so forth? Have you asked yourself? If you live in a world where it's $2 or less, chances are you don't have what in your house?
Electricity.
But you don't have a refrigerator. Which means what? The food you eat, you do what? You got to go buy. So whatever you eat for the day is purchased outside the house. All right? So when everything gets raised by some sort of catastrophe, you've lost your access to food. Okay? So think about it. $2 or less. I mean, that's like per day. Means that cup of coffee that you bought today and I bought today, okay, is that, what is it? It's what? Yeah, it's a $12.50, right? Let's say this was a KD. KD in U.S. terms is what? $3.60. Or $3.59 as of this morning, according to Jim. Huh? So I basically, by buying this cup of coffee, okay, I wouldn't be able to afford this cup of coffee because my $2 a day.
How do they?
Well,
like, I mean, if they have a family, like how would they do it on a regular day without the?
You know, I don't know because I have never experienced it. Okay. But my chances are they're not going to Starbucks or Starbucks ain't opening up a shop in that village that is basically living on $2 a day. Okay, because it's just, they're not going to be buying the coffee. All right. Another thing, life expectancy is less than 60 years of age. I mean, I was at Mubarak Hospital last night. So one of my players got hurt, and I went with him went into the hospital. And the technology you have in Mubarak Hospital, which is what? A public institution. I couldn't believe it. It was just like out of this world. I mean, the state-of-the-art stuff that I hadn't even seen before. He had to have a CAT scan. Okay? He had to be monitored for his vitals. It was utterly amazing. Okay? Well, those things help detect if you're sick, right? Well, if you don't have access to medical care, you know, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, what do you think if in terms of the kind of jobs you do? Those things affect access to health care, medicines, all right? So you have life expectancy is less than 60 years old, which means, I mean, think about this. Who in here ever caught bronchitis? Got sick, got your chest cold? Who here got a chest cold? Guess what? When we would have got a chest cold 200 years ago, there was a good chance we wouldn't have survived. I got caught in a ski blizzard when I was 17 years old. We almost froze. But I got so sick after that, right? Guess what? I would have died if that was, or at least, who knows if my body would have responded. But the point is, chances are, there was a higher likelihood that I would have died before penicillin came into, when it entered the public domain. Okay? Many basically lack sanitation. We talked about the idea of bathrooms, right? You got to go to an outhouse. Many lack safe drinking water. Okay, Many lack adequate housing. Many are undernourished. These are all those things, and we take a look at the global south, there's a tremendous amount of poverty around the world. Poverty, and poverty is relative. A poor person in the United States could be a rich person in another country, okay? Or a poor person in a city in the United States could be rich if it was a poor person, they were a poor family in another part, let's say in a more southern, a rural area in another part of the United States. So you gotta be careful. So one of the things that we as, let's say like the United Nations has to do, it has to come up with what? Indicators, right? It has to come up with ways to measure the human conditions. It's got to look for certain types of variables that are good predictors about whether or not the conditions in that society are good or bad. And good or bad means, that's a normative term. What is good? What is bad? These are terms that we need to clarify. And what good for you may be bad. I mean, you know, maybe having a TV. Book that I recommend you ladies read is the Lexus